Do you have the right to slay your unborn fetus? We're talking about the Irish abortion referendum, and also a little bit on the Frankfurt School. That should be interesting, something that I want to cover in more depth in the future as well. We're going to get an expert on it at some point.
If only the parents of the Frankfurt School people had abortions, the world would maybe be in a better place, but anyway.
That's a pretty harsh rebuke. Yeah. This is episode 88 of the Scottish Liberty Podcast. Two fat ladies with your hosts who are decidedly neither fat nor ladies. Me, Antony Sammeroff.
And me, the male identifying Tom Laird.
Excellent. And the skinny identifying.
Mm-hmm.
So, interesting. Abortion is something that we've discussed doing on the show sometime.
Yeah. And
we have different positions on it. So, do you want to start with your view? Because you've got quite a well-articulated view.
Well, I'm glad you said that. I mean, how articulated it will be, having just got out of bed about half an hour ago.
What you sound like when you're in the pub discussing it is, right, is it a life? Is it a human life? I know that sounds nothing like you, but take us through the argument against abortion.
Alright, the argument against abortion is, as libertarians, if government exists at all,
right,
one of its main functions, and I'm sure you would agree with this part at least, one of its functions is to protect life and liberty, and individual life and liberty. So the argument really is about the right to choose versus right to life. So for me, so you then have to discuss whether or not a fetus is first of all a life, second of all a human life, and if it is indeed a human life, what point does it become a human life and have the same rights and entitlements as any other individual human?
And your position is that it's a conception.
It's a conception. It's the other than that, where else could you really draw it? I mean, that's a conception, and by that I mean at the point where the egg is fertilised and it embeds itself in the wall of the womb, and then it begins its life proper.
So when it's fertilised, but if it's not hit the wall of the womb, and
I guess it's not. I guess I'd be prepared to concede that one.
Okay. Interesting. So wait, what's your position then on the morning after pill? Is that murder?
I guess if I had to be purist about it, I mean, is the morning after? I mean, is it going to be embedded in the wall by that time? I have no idea.
I think that
a medical man.
I'm not really sure how it works, but I actually think it makes the wall recede so that it can't be implanted.
Okay,
but I'm not. Maybe someone can educate us on that.
I think it's a better option than waiting till you're 20 weeks in or 16 weeks in or 12 weeks in and then decide that you want to terminate the pregnancy. Now that's my position. In a completely libertarian society, in an Ancapistan, I suppose people would live in what would you call them? Covenant communities, where you would decide, we don't allow this kind of thing in our community. If you do it, I don't know, the penalty could be death. That's just what you would contract to in that kind of society. The difficulty I suppose we have is what point does the government have a right to step in and prevent a woman? What really annoys me is when I see a sign that says my body, my choice.
Because the point is, it might not just be your body.
Well, it's not your body. I think that's as silly as saying my body. So I've got a right to flail my arms around indiscriminately, punching people in the face because I've got a right to do what I want with my body. And Mr. Sammeroff seems to be disappearing somewhere.
So many points on this issue.
Okay.
I'm just going to get a notepad because it's really, really compelling.
Okay.
So I guess my first issue is, I just want to put this out, I'm not strongly for abortion. I wish that there was as few abortions performed as possible. I'm just concerned that making it illegal, and I'll talk a bit more about my position, but right now I want to explore your position more. I'll talk more about my position later. I'm just not really sure that I'm willing to use force to stop people having them. So I guess my first question is, okay, if we're going to concede that the embryo is not just a life but a human life and fully fledged human life equal to that of a born person, and bear in mind for most of history most children weren't viable, it was the norm not for women to miscarry, it was the norm for women to die in childbirth or for the baby to be removed in case they died in childbirth. And also most kids didn't live past a year or two. You know, people would have big families because because half of their children would die.
That's interesting. Would that justify
infanticide?
Yeah, bombing brown people in Syria and Afghanistan because their kids aren't as viable as ours? They tend to die in infancy.
That's not the case I'm making. Okay. What I was going to actually although, yeah, exactly. I'm just throwing out all the relevant information so people can compile it in the way they want. Supposing you have in your left hand a jar with a couple of embryos in it, they're viable, they've been taken out their mum's womb and they can be put back in their mum's womb. Yeah. And in your right hand you have a baby, are you... and someone says, right, one of these is going in the bin, the born baby or the two embryos, are you going to choose the two embryos over the born baby? And if not, why? And if yes, why?
I don't know, is that a realistic dichotomy? Is it a realistic scenario?
Well, the point is basically to ask if it's a thought experiment, but obviously the point is an embryo as important as a person that's born? Is their life as important?
Well, are children as important as adults, would you say?
In a way, I don't know. Well, sometimes we make judgments like children are more important than adults. Yeah. For example, women and children first, or if you're in a lifeboat, if you're asked to say, and we've obviously got socialised healthcare, so the medical... The government or the NHS makes a judgment between giving an operation to an old person or giving an operation to a child. They prioritise the child because it's thought they've got more life to go. Sure. Therefore, they're more valuable. So I don't know if I've got a position on that, but why don't you argue both sides?
We're kind of wandering into the trolley bus scenario here, aren't we? Let's supposing that the child that needs medical treatment as opposed to a nuclear scientist or a medical genius.
Would you save a person that was going to be able to save lots of people?
Well, I'm glad that's not my judgment call, to be quite honest with you.
I guess... Sorry, do you want to go?
No. Okay.
I guess my position is that we've got a long-standing tradition of holding people who are born fully formed as of higher priority to the unborn or the future generation, and therefore whatever way you look at it, now as I said, I think in a free society we'd want to do everything we can to limit the number of abortions. It would be better if the Heritage Foundation has spent so much money campaigning to get abortion banned or reverse Roe v. Wade, but if they'd actually just paid women to take children to term, that would have saved more, that would have cut down on abortions. Another thing they could do is, I don't know how, obviously education about contraception, but another thing that they can do is make buying children legal. So you'd have people who were desperate to have children buy up children that are otherwise going to be aborted, and that would be mutually beneficial. I would prefer doing those things first and seeing how many abortions would be performed before making it illegal.
I suppose a counter argument to that is if it starts a trade then in fetuses. Do you have fetus farms? Do you have gangs of guys running basically like a battery factory with women churning out fetuses for sale.
and then the problem with it is, I think, more realistically, if it becomes a thing, so many women will be trying to have children to make some money if they're poor, that actually the value of a baby will go down to like about £100 or something ridiculous than that, and it won't actually save any abortions because it'll be the people who are doing it deliberately to make money who get it. I don't know, that's more of a utilitarian standpoint, but I guess my next argument, or my next point of discussion, this is a very well-mannered debate, that if you're wondering why it's so well-mannered, it's because we're actually recording from a pub at the moment. That's why we're audio only. If we're doing this in our flat, we'd probably be getting annoyed at each other. You guys are probably annoyed at the fact that we're not like being vicious. The next point, I guess, it might happen yet. Dame, where did my point go?
I'm sorry about that.
It's probably my so you've got something to say?
Well, I guess, I mean, the whole reason we're discussing this is because, as you may or may not know, Ireland, or ERA, if you like to call it that, Erin Gobra, across the water there, is having a referendum on Friday to repeal, I think it's Section 8, Article 8 of their Constitution, which guarantees the right of the unborn to life. So this is going to be a big thing. I know that there's lots of people of Irish descent returning from all over the world to go back to Ireland and vote on this. Now, this is an interesting thing, because whatever way it goes, does the majority have the right to dictate to an individual what they should do? To use the phrase, the terminology of the feminists, with their own body, or does even the majority have the right to say that a life can be taken with impunity? Should that be ever a majority decision?
So this is one of the points that I love to make about how, well, everyone sings the praises of democracy. Democracy is, sometimes people suggest that we are market fundamentalists and that our God is the free market. But the only religion in politics is democracy. It's the only thing that everyone almost accepts unquestioningly as an unambiguous good. So take that. Democrats. Now, and I don't mean Democrats as in the blues, I just mean people who are for democracy. So the point is, right, both conservatives and liberals, and I mean left liberals, consider themselves to be for democracy and for protecting democracy. But when it comes to an issue that they're split on, like abortion, where are the conservatives who, when the majority who are for abortion, for the right to an abortion? Because I'm not for abortion. I would like there to not be abortions. I'm for the right to an abortion, and even so, grudgingly so. But and I can speak more about why later. When the majority are for the right to abort, do the conservatives, who are so for democracy, say, well, I guess that's majority rule, I mean, democracy, fair enough, 51% say that? And likewise, will the feminists, or anyone, you don't have to be a feminist to be for the right to abort, I guess, will they secede or cede that ground? See if 55% are against abortion. Ireland's a Catholic country. It's very important to the religious people there that the life is sacred, the life of the unborn child is sacred. Will they go, oh, well, I guess that's democracy? Majority says no, especially, and it just shows the hypocrisy. Now, one of the arguments in favour of the right to abort is that there's a book called Freakonomics. I don't know how far it came out, how long ago it came out, maybe 15 years or so ago. And one of the things he does is chart the drop in crime in the 90s, or whenever crime started dropping. And he linked it to, it doesn't prove causation, but it's highly correlated to, he suggests one of the reasons why the crime rate started falling is there was so many fewer unwanted children that and fewer children from single parent homes, that led to a drop in the crime rate. Now, I'm not really sure if that's proven, but it is a utilitarian argument, and since most anarcho-capitalists, I know David Friedman is a consequentialist, he's a utilitarian, Mises was a utilitarian, Henry Hazlitt was a real utilitarian, but most libertarians are deontologists. They believe in principles, so that's a utilitarian argument might not be compelling to them, but it is one of the arguments that's put forward to the right to abort, which is that it will lead to overall better outcomes because there'll be fewer unwanted children that will have horrible childhoods because they're unwanted, and then become criminals to boot. What would you say?
I don't know if I accept the necessary conclusions from that Freakonomics sort of survey or those statistics. I mean, who's to say what horrible childhood? I mean, there are lots of great people, great scientists, great statesmen,
humanists, because they had a horrible childhood. They want to help other people.
Yeah, and it made them what they are. I'm not suggesting you should deliberately give your child a horrible childhood because it could turn them the other way. It could turn them into a criminal. But there are many people out there who had horrible childhoods, and it made them what they were. It made them great statesmen or great scientists, or maybe, I don't know, maybe they'd have been great scientists or statesmen anyway, even if they had a good child. Maybe they'd have even better. I have no idea. But I think it's dangerous to decide that, you know, what is and what is not a good childhood when it's not your kids.
So before we go on to talk about a little bit about what other libertarians have had to say about the question of abortion, what I really want to ask you is, are you willing to jail a woman or a doctor for having an abortion?
Well, are you willing to do it? Are you willing to jail someone for killing a newborn baby?
Yes, but the question is, are you willing to jail someone for having an abortion?
I guess I would be, if that was the law.
The mum and the surgeon, or?
I suppose so, yeah.
You had a point about the Hippocratic Oath, which I think was well made.
And by the way, I'm talking. I was obviously talking from a libertarian standpoint there, where you have covenant communities, but the Hippocratic, yeah, sure. If it must be, if it goes ahead, then I don't think that it should be doctors. I mean, okay, you could make any sort of case about the Hippocratic Oath, should it even be a thing. But we do have it. Doctors take an oath that they should first do no harm. And I think that the carrying out of a termination, other than those 1% situations, I mean, probably less than 1% situations where there is a direct threat to the life of the mother, I think that it's a direct violation of that Hippocratic Oath. So if it has to be done, then there should be specialists trained to do it.
Wait a second, right? Yeah. Your acknowledgement that, say, someone is the life of the mother is at risk, implies you already see a fully born person as of greater importance than a fetus. So that's already a distinction in terms of rights. You're prioritising the life of the mother over the...
I'm not. I'm just saying in that situation I would be prepared to concede that. However, it's 1% of 1% of all abortions carried out, and I think it's a matter then for a medical decision and the decision of the parent.
But why is
the woman
the
might decide not to.
allowed to save her life if the baby's life is of equal importance?
Well, I don't know if it's of equal importance.
Well, see, now there is the crux of the issue, the crux of our disagreement, because I'm not saying that the fetus is not a life. In fact, I'm not really.
Anybody would concede that it's a life.
But see, this is actually an important decision, because I'm not really even sure if we could say, at least in the early stages of, say, an embryo or a zygote or the fetus, in the early stages of development, before it has a central nervous system, for example, and I know you're allowed to abort a baby after it's got a central nervous system, if saying it's a life is not purely rhetorical, because saying it's a life implies a sense of individuality, a sense of that it is a separate organism from the parent. And I'm not sure that at least in the early stages of development, a baby is a life. You could say it is alive, it is living tissue, but is it a separate and distinct life? And if it's not, then you have grounds for abortion.
Is an amoeba a life?
It is, but it has an independent existence.
Because we talk about finding life on other planets, and in many instances, including Mars and places, we're talking about microbes, right. And we call it life. So
yeah, life, alive.
So would you agree? Okay, could we agree then that it's a life form?
No, because again, I can't agree on that, because again, I'm not sure that it has any distinct identity. Does a
dandelion have a distinct identity?
Well, yeah, we can define the boundaries of what is dandelion and what is soil and what is air, so I would say it does have a distinct identity, whereas fetus that's connected to its mother for food has certainly before it grows a central nervous system, it has no means of perception whatsoever. You need a central nervous system to perceive. Once it gets one, the ability to perceive is so primitive that whether you actually think that there's any lights on there is anything to perceive, we don't really know that. We don't have the information on whether there is anything perceiving anything. And my argument would be, if that is true, if there's no perception going on, it's not a life. It is alive, it is life, but it's not got there's no life, there's no specific life there to be terminated.
So let me turn your question back to you. Would you be prepared to prosecute a mother and a doctor after a central nervous system has been established and it is alive?
Well, here's the critical question. For me, no, at this point, and I can even tell you what would make me change my mind. At this point, no, because I actually feel like the repercussion, and this is quite utilitarian, especially for me, I feel like the repercussions of doing that would create a much bigger violations of the NAP than doing it. Now, what might change my mind is if, for example, we implemented, the right to buy children, and we were in a stateless situation where, if we got to a point where you could quite easily pay off women and things like that, and there was abortions happening with impunity, and the deterrence there was no deterrence for it, and it was happening at the same rates as now, or much greater rates. I would start to think whether there's something that, and you disproved, I guess I'm quite vague on that, but I could be turned on it. It's more like, as I feel like in general, when we look at human psychology, like, I guess I'm a utopian or idealist, so to speak, in the sense that some people who are very socially conservative think that humans are just dicks, and like you're always going to have all these maladies to the extent we have now, whereas I kind of think a lot of pathology in the world is caused by the kind of childhoods we have, and things like that. So in that way, I believe in the libertarian new man in the same way that the Marxists believe in the Marxist new man. But I would be willing to be disillusioned of that if we had the kind of society in which you weren't forced through 11 to 13 years of education, and yet everyone was still a statist, and it wasn't the norm to isolate and physically harm children when their brain's developing and things like that. If we went through that transition and people were still complete dicks and the world was a nightmare, I'd go, okay, I need to abandon my utopianism. Obviously it's more nature than nurture. So in the same way, I'm more inclined to say, let's focus on what we can change, and see if that results in better results. If it doesn't, then I'm more likely to say, well, we have got a serious problem here, and maybe a heavier hand is required.
Okay, well, let me ask this question to you and to everybody else who's listening as well. What do you think that this referendum's going to go ahead, and whatever way it goes, I guess that will be the result for however many years they decide. What would be a better way of resolving this rather than a referendum that will be binding on one set of people over another, one way or another? What would be a better way of doing that? How would this issue better be resolved in a libertarian fashion?
Yeah, and I've not got a clear answer for that, but I think it is an example of where libertarianism falls short, because essentially, even if you don't believe in representative democracy or direct democracy, even in a libertarian society, you need some consensus. I mean, no one's going to build even if you're an individual and you want a seashell burger, no one's going to provide that. You're going to have to make it up for yourself. When you go, the market's not perfect. When you go into a restaurant, you can't have a choice of any dish you want, but you get the kind of services that most people want in general. There is some kind of majoritarianism built into personal and political decision making. That's because we don't live in a utopia. And essentially, in a ANCAP society, or even in a minarchist society, there is going to be some deferral to the majority cultural mores. And if you believe that morality is permanently immutable, whether you think that means you should have the right to abortion or not, you're essentially, it's going to go the way the vocal majority wants. It's not going to be based on principle. It's going to be based on what is the vocal majority.
Okay, and how would you feel about, obviously it takes two to tango. Everybody focuses on the rights of the woman, even though the fetus at some point may turn out to be a woman in of itself. What about if you're a husband, or indeed just a partner of someone who's pregnant,
and you want the baby,
you're willing to pay for it, you're willing to see it through to termination? Should you be able to sue or get an injunction to prevent that person from carrying out?
That's really interesting, and this is one of the points in which that I'm so glad to be an ANCAP, because it gives me the liberty of saying I don't know what's best, but I think that in an ANCAP society,
isn't that just
all
a way
sorts
of sort of
dodging the question? Well, I would like to say that me personally, I would my personal inclination is to say, yeah, sorry feminists, but that guy should have a right to stop that abortion.
Are you prepared to use force and violence?
No, I'm prepared to I guess in a way I'm prepared to prevent the woman from going. But the thing is, this is really weird, because it depends how much you believe in, like, the thing is, do you believe that the woman having a child in her which she doesn't want is going to affect the development of the child? And I do think it does. Like in India in the old days, when there was a very big awareness that the state of mind of the mother affects the child, so there was a culture of, when a mother was pregnant, to just have her lie in her room and have relatives come and visit, and her not to be exposed to any stress, so that the vibration, so to speak, sorry to use such a woo-woo term, would inculcate in the child. They had her very big belief in those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Now we have women working, smoking, drinking, whatever. It's like, it's not a thought that anything you put in your body, whether it's physical, emotional, or otherwise, is going to affect your baby. So there's so many avenues, and I don't think there's ever been such a thorough discussion of this as we've had. But yeah, I mean,
such a civil discussion.
Yeah, my personal view is that I'm inclined to think that it would be good to find a way of making it as painless as possible for that woman, taking her needs into consideration, to bring that baby to term and allow the dad to adopt it and go away if necessary with the child. But I think in Anacappistan, everything will be tried, and over time the market knows best, the best methods will win out over time, like a sieve. Let's talk a little bit about what other libertarians thought. So, for example, a bad argument for abortion, which you hear, and I would probably hazard a guess on the left, is this idea of the violinist. What if you kidnapped a violinist and stitched him up to someone so that he needed that person in order to live? Would you be wrong in cutting him off so that he has to die, even if he's a world famous, wonderful violinist? And most people would say no, fuck him. If the person doesn't want him, then he's parasitic upon their livelihood, and a fetus is just like that. The ridiculousness of that essay, the rhetoric of that essay, is the obvious point that you don't choose to wake up one morning with a violinist stitched to you, whereas you do choose to have sex. And therefore,
in most instances.
Oh well, let's take a sidestep then. What about the rape issue then?
Okay, I personally, it's a horrible crime. Are you asking me whether a woman should be allowed to have an abortion in the case of rape?
Yes.
Again, I'm glad it's not my decision, but why would?
But you'd say no.
Well, okay, right, why? I guess in most instances, you'd know you'd been raped.
Yeah.
There's a morning after pill. There's a time to do it.
That's a good point.
Do you decide to wait, 4 months, 3 months, and then decide you're going to get rid of a baby?
I agree with you.
Basically, you're punishing the innocent for the crime of the guilty.
I understand that point, but I would just add that from a more human perspective, sorry, I don't mean to say that yours is inhuman. It's a traumatic event. You might have doubts, you might have guilt. Oh, I don't know if I want to kill it or not. Like, I feel really bad. I don't want to do it, but I also really do want to do it. And it might take you that time to actually come to terms with and finally realise that, yeah, you couldn't actually bear.
I think this would be a good point then to talk about right to evict.
Well, that's what I was going to go into next, because I said that was going to go into what other libertarians thought. Just a moment though. So before we do the right to evict, there is a lineage in libertarian thought, because the right to evict is sort of a product of Walter Moderate Block, as he likes to know himself, because he says he's the one that resolves libertarian disputes by taking the middle position. His mentor was, of course, the late great Murray Rothbard. Murray Rothbard had a very interesting position to take, and it comes back to this violinist, which is he essentially took the Catholic position on the fetus, which was to say, yes, it is a life, it is a human life. However, I am going to have to maintain that you have the right to an independent life. Because we don't allow people the right to life if they're dependent on another life. You know, you have got the right.
Well, by force.
Well, you've got the right to let die, and by the same token, that fetus can't live independently of the mother, and therefore we're going to have to take the position that you've got the right to abort, even though it is a life. Ayn Rand, of course, was strongly for the right to abortion, because she thought that sex was something that should be able to be enjoyed for its own I'm not really sure how strong her position was, but I'm just putting that in there.
Why not get your fallopian tubes tied up? Do you know what I mean?
Well, it's become easier and easier to take preventative action. So what about the point, we're not going to take the straw man argument that you just woke up one day with this fetus inside you, because that is just a ridiculous argument, and the fact that it's taught in all the philosophy universities is quite frankly giving too much credit to a stupid ass argument. It just shows how little the left are concerned with personal responsibility. But maybe Katrina Angus will shoot onto this YouTube video and give us her perspective on abortion.
She's pro-choice.
She is pro-choice. Okay. And so do you think that Murray Rothbard's argument that no, you've not got a right to life, you've got a right to an independent life is flawed?
I could go along with it. It's better than what we have. I think with the current situation, I mean, I'm sure there's plenty of people out there on the pro-life side who'd be perfectly willing to put money into keeping a fetus alive. Technology's getting better, medical science is getting better at doing these things. We'll probably be able to keep, I mean, even as we speak, we can keep children alive who are younger than the
that's true.
than
the incubators.
So I think that's a matter of time before we can actually keep fetuses alive. Currently we can even freeze them. Would that be correct?
I know we can freeze the embryos, but I don't know if we can freeze fetuses. Interestingly, So
I think maybe there's possibly a technological way through this. Just it's worth mentioning there, while Antony was taking a toilet break there, someone approached him, because we're doing this in a public place, somebody said, now, we were here first, we homesteaded this little part of the pub.
Nice one.
Yeah, and a couple came over and sat down, and the woman was clearly upset by our conversation. They moved, fine, but as I say, we were here first. And the man approached, don't worry, this is not going somewhere seedy, the man approached Antony in the toilet.
Politely, I should add.
And said, that his wife was a bit upset by our conversation, and said that she thought it's a conversation that only women should have. That is quite simply and it's a sexist argument.
And the interesting thing is, I was just like, well, we're just putting our opinions out. Like, neither of us is saying that we're the law. And actually, we're just exploring all positions. I'm trying to give as much detail as possible and consider as many positions as possible.
Bearing in mind that this is a referendum that's going on in Ireland, and men will be allowed to vote in that referendum.
She probably thinks only women should be allowed to vote in it.
Possibly.
Well, the interesting... So... This is the technological side. Yes, maybe one day we can take it out and put it in an incubator. And this is something that came into my attention from our conversations, maybe going back 2 years or more, which is that I had the thought that the right to evict in a way was worse than just aborting the child. And I never put my attention on that fact until we had a conversation about it, because obviously, as everyone who listens to this knows, I'm a psychologist, I'm a therapist, right? I'm very concerned with the way that our early life events affect the development of the organism for the rest of its life. For example, if you're
certainly getting a harpoon through your head as a fetus is certainly going to ruin your day.
And that revealed a prejudice in me, which is that, and I only noticed it through our conversations informally, which is that deep down, I obviously believed, and maybe still believe, that a horrible fraught life is worse than no life at all. Because I was thinking, I know people who are born prematurely, were put in incubators straight afterwards, and have had severe anxiety their whole life, and I believe that's because of the conditions of their birth. I myself was born with the umbilical cord around my neck. You don't get enough oxygen. It affects the way that your brain forms, and there's good evidence to say that creates a tendency towards a fearful personality for life. So, and I definitely have first-hand experience of a fearful personality, and I guess that I thought eviction, which if we've not actually clarified our term, so which is the idea that you've not got a right to an abortion, but as soon as the fetus is viable outside the womb, you've got a right to evict it. That's Walter Block's point. So you can't kill it, but you can wait until it's viable and forcibly... and I was thinking, oh, that's bad, because that's going to have permanent deleterious effects on the child. And if you believe in the non-aggression principle, and not just Minarchus way, but an ANCAP way, there might be grounds for suing your parents for evicting you, and therefore causing permanent psychological damage to you. Okay,
but surely if you own a property and you evict people out of your property, surely that causes them some sort of stress or psychological, harm and neurosis.
That's a very creative argument, and I credit you with that. But for one thing,
okay.
Contract. You've not contracted with your unborn child. And that just shows, but this just shows the fucked upness of my position, whether it's right or wrong. Because let's just argue by analogy to adults. I was see if you accept the fact that abortion is murder. I'm not really quite willing to cross that bridge yet, but maybe I could be talked round. I was basically saying that being heavily assaulted is worse than being killed. That was my. I'm not saying if my position. Maybe I still hold that position. I'm not really sure yet. But basically, if I hold the position that it's worse to artificially induce pregnancy and then put that fetus in an incubator for 3 months, because it's going to be fucked up for the rest of its life, better just kill it. Better just kill it before it gets to that stage, which was my position before we started talking about this. Now I'm not so sure. I was basically saying stabbing someone 17 times is a worse thing to do to them, because that's going to fuck them up for the rest of their life than just killing them outright.
Okay, but let's take that argument to what I would think would be a logical conclusion. After the baby's born, if it has complications, at what point do you decide that it's better off just to kill it because it's had so many complications?
Well, this comes round to my position sounding more reasonable, which is it's up to the parents. That's what I would say.
Even after the child's born?
After the child's born, if there's complications in the birth and it's got serious conditions and things like that, and it can't live without medical help, my position would be it's up to the parents how much medical help it gets.
So it's being deaf. Is that?
I'm talking about the fact that it's not viable without medical help. If the baby isn't viable without medical help, the parents have the right to say no.
I don't know if I can agree. But
what if we live in a private system where there's no socialised healthcare and they have to personally pay to save their own child? Would you say it's up to them whether they part money with that or not?
It's certainly up to them whether they part money with or not. I don't know if it's up to them to prevent somebody else from doing it. From
charity. That's a great distinction. We're so good on the Scottish Liberty podcast. We really get into the nitty gritty. Well, what I would say is, with that point about... because I like to be controversial, let me just say a point on eugenics, because you brought that up. Everyone is, to a degree, for eugenics. There are 24 conditions in the human genome that if you are born with that condition, you will die before you reach puberty, and your whole life up to then would be absolutely horrendously painful. There's 12 or 24 conditions that genetic defects. If you had a magic wand, anyone would remove those 24 genetic defects from the human genome. No one would say so. Everyone is to a degree for eugenics. No one with a sense of compassion, unless you were so religious you said, well, God chose those genetic defects to be there. Most people would say if you could wave a magic wand and remove them. So the genetic...
God certainly didn't choose Down syndrome. Down syndrome. As I was thinking of sort of like thalidomide, which is caused by human beings. But I mean, like Down syndrome, for example, is a genetic condition. Why would and people, I think, was it Denmark decided that they were going to eradicate this thing. Does the medical establishment and the government have the right to do that?
Well, this really depends on how
We're slightly drifting away here, but
but it's fine. It depends on how utilitarian or deontological you are. They're obviously looking at the future and thinking, if we can eradicate this, then it'll never happen again. Personally, to me, it's unpalatable. I'm not particularly for it. Although I would say, actually, if I think about it honestly, I would say if you have this actually helps me clarify my position on abortion, because if I'm honest and I look into my heart and I say, do you think you have the right to screen your womb to find out if your embryo has a genetic defect such as the 12 conditions that I talked, or Down syndrome? And do you have the right to take that embryo out of your womb if they find out that it has Down syndrome or one of these 12 conditions? I would say actually you do, which means that I'm fundamentally for abortion. Now, I would
be right to evict as well.
I would hazard to say, I say that I lean towards that. I'm not gung-ho for it, but I lean toward. But no, it's not, because you say you've got the right to evict it, but then you're evicting it assuming that it's going to die.
Why would you assume that? I mean, there's plenty of people who may be willing to take on the responsibility of looking after that fetus.
Okay.
Nobody evicts people out their flat assuming that they're going to die.
Well, maybe the solution is
get government out of it.
Maybe the solution is you should try and sell your baby, and if you can't find only if you cannot find someone who's willing to take on the responsibility of that child, do you have the right to abort it.
Right.
That's me being Antony moderate Sammeroff.
Here's the thing. Let me ask this, but probably finally. When, as libertarians, when we say you have a right to life, and that is a basic libertarian principle, right to life, what do we mean by that?
You have the right, I believe you have the right not to be aggressed against. That's all we mean when you say you have the right to life.
When does that right not to be aggressed against commence?
Thank you, that's a very useful clarification. Well, I guess for me, it's when you're an independent entity.
But what do you mean by independent? I mean, 10 years old, 12 years old?
I would say
look after yourself?
I would say basically the same point as the eviction point, when you're viable outside the womb. And the reason for that
no baby's viable outside the womb. It has to be fed.
That's a good point. And obviously in Sparta and things like that, they used to expose children.
Yeah.
Well, all throughout history, infanticide has been practiced. The most charitable.
Some people put an end to it. Emperor Constantine put an end to it. He made it a capital offence to kill unborn children.
Right. Well, I mean, I just want to say the most charitable interpretation of the infanticide was that resources were scarce, and it's better to kill your newborn than for your older children to starve to death. The least charitable events were obviously routine infant sacrifice, such as the Aztecs and the Incas practice, and other cultures, Carthage and so forth. It was the norm.
The Canaanites, I think, done it as well.
The norm to sacrifice children. So, I guess. But let me start there. Maybe it is
still the norm then to sacrifice children, because I think that's exactly what we're doing currently. I think that the amount of abortions that go on vastly for mostly either cosmetic or socio-economic reasons, rather than the usual reasons that, you know, the pro-choice people give. Oh, what about rape? What about these things are you know, and for me that's a red herring argument whenever you get that, because it's such a small amount. And you know, if you to say,
I agree with you. I agree with you on that point.
If you to say to someone, you know, okay,
Allow abortion for rape. Allow abortion.
Can we agree that all the other ones are bad and shouldn't be allowed? Then you're never going to get an agreement on that.
Well, maybe you will in a small percentage of cases, but I guess this has been really helpful for me to clarify my own opinions, because when it came down to it, when you asked, well, when is it considered viable, I've come up with a moderate new answer to that I've never heard anywhere else. As libertarians, we're quite fond of saying morality is immutable and is the truth throughout all time, which is the non-aggression principle. But maybe this is an issue that has evolved throughout time, because it depends on our technological capacity to look after children. So we could say that maybe exposing your children was not actually immoral in a time when, if you didn't kill your babies, your older children would have starved to death because you didn't have the means to provide for a family. And as we have become more abundant as a society, it's become less and less moral to have an abortion because of the material conditions in which we bring a child. And when we get to the technological point where you can take an embryo out of a woman's womb and put it into an incubator where it can grow outside of a human being and hopefully psychologically still turn out okay, then it will be completely immoral at that point to have an abortion and kill that embryo, because our material condition is such that we can actually allow that. And that's my final libertarian. Do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, only to say it just depends on how you feel about morality and what the root of your moral compass is, whether your morality is based on whatever seems to be right at any given moment or whatever seems workable at any given moment, or whether you think there's a deeper principle. Obviously my moral compass comes from a sort of Judeo-Christian ethic and the sanctity of life, and that. So it's always going to differ. So I don't have my right to impose my religious values on anybody. But I guess what we do as a society, if I can use that word already, is we already say, you can't go around killing people, you can't go around robbing people.
And you can't go around killing fetuses.
And you can't go around killing fetuses is what they say in Ireland, but that might change on Friday.
Right, thank you. I just want to, before we wrap up, just chart a little bit of my history on this issue. Okay. Because when I was growing up, I had an instinctive revulsion against abortion. I even remember some Christian handing me a picture of a fetus or something like that and saying blah blah blah. And actually, this is maybe at the age of 14, 15, like instinctively I was like, I'm already against abortion, and I was. Then I learned a little bit more about politics. Actually, my own mother, to my surprise, had 2 abortions. I didn't know that growing up. I only found out that when I told her that I was against abortion, and she was like, well, I had abortion. I was like, well, I wouldn't be on this planet if not for my mother's abortion. And that made me think. Then I got to feel a little bit more sympathetic. I just had...
Back up a bit there. You wouldn't be on the planet if it wasn't for an abortion.
For my mother having... If my mother had brought those babies to term, I wouldn't have been born.
But maybe you would have been one of those babies.
Well, yeah, as a person with kind of spiritual views, it's very possible. So maybe I've died twice, and this is my 3rd incarnation.
I knew there was some reason for it.
I knew there was some reason why I'm so wise. I mean, this is my 3rd time trying to get into this.
Can I just say, as a former stand-up comedian, I've died many more times than that.
Yeah, very excellent. So that gave me pause for thought when my mum told me she'd had abortions. When I was in school, I took part in a play by Brian Friel. It's called Lovers, and it's about they find out they live in Ireland. She finds out that she's pregnant. They're not married. That's a taboo. That gave me pause for thought on abortion, and I guess somehow or other I came to the conclusion that allowing, not that I was comfortable with abortion or was for it, and I mean that's something that we've joked about, and I think I actually changed your position slightly, because you had the language for abortion or against abortion, and I kind of took the piss out of it. I was like, right, who the fuck is for abortion? Like, no one's out like, let's get as many abortions as possible. No one's for abortion. It's the distinction between being for the right to abort.
I don't know. I mean, the Chinese government were for abortion.
Well, Cuba, the Cuban government actively encourages abortion.
Right.
So I guess they are for abortion. For me, I've never been for abortion. I've been... I'm for the right to have an abortion, but I wish as few abortions happen as possible. And if there's any non-violent means of encouraging less abortions, and for them. Yeah. But even recently, and I hope the person concerned doesn't mind me, obviously no personal disclosures, but a lot of people who listen to this know that I'm a therapist, and I probably mentioned it in this podcast, had a client who had their first child coming up to a full decade after having an abortion, and just having the child has triggered her into all those feelings of guilt and shame and regret, and everything that happened around that time that led to her decision to abort that child, and helping her work through the difficult emotions. It really makes it real to you of how horrible it is and how much you really want to minimise the occurrences of abortion.
I guess the hardcore feminist would turn around and say, well, that's because society's put such a guilt trip on you. You know, if you had people outside the abortion clinic cheering and waving flags and go, you go girl, and when she came out she got a big party to celebrate, maybe maybe she wouldn't feel so rotten about
and that's simply not true. I mean, if anything, the people around her are very compassionate towards her, but the bottom line is she feels horrible.
But isn't that compassion in of itself given her guilt?
I can't answer that question. I feel very compassionate for the human condition. I wouldn't be...
Except for fetuses.
Well, that's the thing. The bottom line is, I know you're being jocular when you say that, but the bottom line is, because quite frankly, they're not born yet, they don't have a history, they don't have a whole bunch of memories and things like that, whereas fully living people do. And I am compassionate for the pain of someone who has an abortion, and the compassionate for the child of someone who had them even if they didn't want them. I'm compassionate for adults who feel like yourself strongly that that's a horrible violation of the rights of the fetus to actually terminate a child. Like, I feel compassion for that position, but ultimately when it comes down to it, I think that fully fledged adults have more rights than a fetus does, and they're not bringing the baggage and the views.
Well, you say more rights. How can you have more rights? I mean, surely every individual has the same amount of rights.
Well, you've got right to... Yeah, exactly, and that's my exact prob. Thank you, you're helping me clarify even more. In order for you to live as a fetus, other people have to have positive obligations towards you. In other words, the obligation to hold you in their womb for 6 months. And as much as I would rather you weren't aborted than you were aborted, I think that they've got the right to say, fucking sack that shit, I'm not carrying you in my womb for another 6 months. And I don't like the fact that you're getting aborted, but if I had to make a judgment call, I am going to stand for the rights of the adult above your rights, quite frankly, because you've got no life experience, you've got no perception, you've got no memories, you've got nothing to bring to that of any substance, you've got no ability to advocate for yourself. I mean, for fuck's sake, I'm a vegetarian. I quite frankly care more about the pigs that are being forced into tiny sties and forcibly inseminated.
That completely baffles me, but there you go.
Well, I mean, I don't mind this podcast going on for as long as it goes on, because it's been so good so far.
I can't go on forever. I've got to end it somewhere. So I mean, I retain my personal position, which is, I think it's the taking of a human life. Although if Jeremy Corbyn gets into power, I might change my mind on that.
Okay, well, I think we can't do our Frankfurt School, but that's just to whet your appetite for the next edition. And I'm sure you won't be the only ones saying, you will join me when I say this has been one of my favourite episodes of the Scottish Liberty Podcast, if not my favourite. So tune in next week, subscribe on iTunes, share the YouTube with all your friends, and until next week, be libertarians, don't be a
dick.
Or a fanny. And don't have an abortion.